All right, guys, in this lesson, we're going to be learning a new technique to get rid of a big eyesore in our app.jsx. Notice how we are creating these card components. And indeed, we do have these customizable, reusable card components for each of which we're passing over different custom props that comes from our contacts array over here. But notice how repetitive it is. We're writing contacts at 0.name, contacts 1.name. It seems like it would really benefit from a loop. In this lesson, I'm going to show you a technique called mapping components, which is going to make it easy for us to map all of these individual custom pieces of data to each of these custom components. And that way we won't have to keep creating card after card after card, and it can be created dynamically. For example, using a form on our website or some input elements. So the map function is a JavaScript function that's really useful for handling arrays, such as our contacts array. So our contacts array currently contains 3 items, and each of these are a JavaScript object with the same properties but different values. Inside our app.js, if instead we can go ahead and comment out these 3 cards, and instead, what we're going to do is we're going to tap into that contacts array, which we have access to because we imported it from the contacts file. And then we're going to call the map function. So we can write contacts.map. Now, note how at the moment it's just typing it out like it's plain text, and that is of course because we're inside a div element as a child, so we have to go ahead and wrap it inside some curly braces so this gets interpreted as JavaScript code. This map function, as the input, the thing that should go inside these parentheses, it expects an actual function. So in this case, we're calling a function and then passing it a function. And this is kind of the fundamentals of what you might call functional programming, where instead of passing values around your code, you're passing functions, even into functions. You can have many, many levels of functions being passed around. So what functionality do we want to happen to each of our contacts? Well, let's go ahead and create a new function up here, and I'm going to call it create card. So this function is going to create a new card component. So I'm going to return a custom card component, and of course I'm going to pass it some properties. So let's say that we just pass it one property, which is the name property, which we know that the card is able to handle and put into this h2. Now this name property, I'm going to set it equal to some value, right? Now let's imagine that this function create card, when it gets called, it gets passed over a single contact. So not an array of contacts, but a single JavaScript object, such as this one or this one. And of course, each of these objects have properties such as ID, name, image URL that we can tap into inside the function. So I could set the name property of the card component to equal contact.name. So now I'm going to pass this entire function, create card, into my map function. So let's go ahead and get it to create a card. And what the map function does is it loops through this array of contacts, and for every single item that exists in the array, it calls the create card function and it passes over each of the objects inside the array. So that means for the first time it loops around, it passes this entire first element in as the contact, and then we can get hold of it inside our return statement and get hold of the name property, which gets put into our card component right here. I can of course go ahead and elaborate on this by adding the image property and set that equal to the contact dot image URL, I think is the name inside our contacts.js. And that now shows up over here. And then maybe I can add another property, the telephone property, which I'll set to equal contact.phone. And finally, I've got the email property, which is just stored inside contact.email. So now I've got my card component, which is getting all of these pieces of information using these properties from our contacts.js, these JavaScript objects with each of these names right here. And that is being sent over as the props for our custom card component, as we can see in our React DevTools. But notice how in the console, we're actually getting a warning here. And this warning doesn't go away when we refresh the browser. So it's actually a real warning instead of some sort of problem with Code Sandbox. And what it tells us is that each child in a list should have a unique key property. This is a really important point. Remember how in the beginning I said that React is able to create a virtual DOM that represents the current appearance of your website. And for it to be able to efficiently render components, for every single component that's being rendered using a loop, such as the map function, we will have to give those components a property that has to be called key. And this property has to be something that is unique amongst each of these card components that's being created using this loop. Luckily, inside our contacts.js, I've got an ID property, which is unique amongst each of these contacts, and we're going to use it as the key. So contact.id. And now once we do that, our warning goes away because we're now conforming with React's rules. Now, this key prop has to be spelled exactly like this, and it's expected by React. And the value can be a string or it can be a number, but it must be unique across all of the repeated components. So in this case, our cards. Now, I have a challenge for you that's going to require a little bit of debugging on your part. See if you can get this key prop, which we know corresponds to the IDs, so 1, 2, and 3, that's being passed over to the card component. See if you can get that rendered as a paragraph tag above the H2. So right here. Pause the video and complete this challenge. And as a hint, you're going to have to dig into the React DevTools to figure out what's actually going on. And then once you're done, come back and we'll go through the solution together. All right, so this was a bit of a trick question because what you will have realized is that if you just go ahead and create a paragraph tag and then inside there you try to get hold of props.key, which we know is the name of the prop being passed over, you can see that not only does it not show up, we also get a warning, and it tells us that key is not a prop. Trying to access it will result in undefined being returned. So if you need it, you should create the same value as a different prop. And we can see this if we actually look inside the React DevTools. If we look at our card, we can see that out of all of the props that we're getting, we don't see that key prop. And the reason is because, as I mentioned, that key property for each React component is a special property, and it's used to ensure the right order of items goes into the tree. It's used so that it can render each of these components efficiently when they're being created from a loop, but it is not something that we can tap into. If we actually wanted to show that ID, which comes from contacts, what we actually have to do is we have to create our own custom prop. Say, for example, ID equals contact.id. And even though it seems a bit repetitive, because it seems like we've already got this key code prop that is contacts.id, but we have to remember that this is not for us to use. So now if I go in here and I change that props to ID, then everything works fine and I don't get any warnings anymore. So DevTools is really, really useful for debugging problems like this. And I'm going to try and trip you up a few times like this, just so that you get a chance to use it and get used to debugging your code, because bugs always happen. It happens to the best of us. And there was a time when I thought I was only a programmer that could create bugs, not code. So it's perfectly normal, and it's really important to get used to the tools. In the next lesson, you're going to be putting this technique into action in a challenge where you're going to map data to React components and render everything from scratch yourself. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there.